Yes.
So, Carol, can we look next at some of your letters to politicians over the years, and in particular the theme of seeking a public inquiry?
Okay, thank you.
If we start at WITN 1055046. So this is a letter from you, 9th of April 2000, and we can see it's addressed to Mr Milburn, so Alan Milburn, from whom the inquiry, in fact, we'll be hearing next week, then Secretary of State for Health. And you say in the first paragraph, I'm the long-term partner of a haemophiliac infected with HIV, hepatitis B and hepatitis C through NHS blood products. My partner also has a haemophiliac brother who died from AIDS through contaminated blood. I watched with dismay a televised debate on the 30th of March in the House of Lords as the government once again turned down the demand for a public inquiry. How can the government justify this decision on what was described in the Lords as the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS, with more deaths than the Marchioness, Southall and Paddington disasters combined, and set to go on claiming lives for many years to come? Okay, just pausing there before we read on. The reference there to the debate, that's looks like that's the trigger for this particular letter.
Yes, it was, yes.
But the call for a public inquiry wasn't new by 2000 either, was it? It was something that had already been being raised by campaigners such as yourself.
Exactly. I mean, it was first raised in the 80s in relation to HIV, and then I raised it in 1994. That was the first year that I raised it.
And then it continues, the government is fond of saying that there's no evidence of negligence and no evidence to suggest a public inquiry. We would like an independent view on this. May I remind you that other countries took this stance until public opinion became so great that these countries were forced to hold public inquiries or risk the consequences at the ballot box. Study the Creever report in Canada and Italy's public inquiry. This government has escaped lightly so far. However, there is so much evidence available now on an international level, which we have access to, which shows incompetence, violation of safety laws, unscreened plasma, unscreened donors, relabelled plasma, relabelled shipping records. I could go on for a very long time, that surely the government should ask itself, how can we not have a public inquiry? The government incriminates itself by throwing in a red herring and saying that nothing could be done to minimise risk of viral infection prior to heat treating in 1985, as if technology is the only means of harm reduction. Attitudes like this make the need for a public inquiry essential. And then you go on to detail, I won't read out all of the rest of this page, but you go on to detail some of the I think this is right, some of the areas which you're suggesting make it ripe for a public inquiry.
Yes, absolutely.
So the policies and safety procedures in the 70s, the importation of factor concentrates, what was known about that, the whole issue of self-sufficiency is what you set out in the rest of that page. And then if we go over the page, we can see you flag up in the third paragraph Dr. Zuckerman and journalists visiting centres, and that's a reference, I think, to the World in Action documentary.
Yes.
And then, skipping another 2 paragraphs down, you then talk about AIDS, emerging evidence of plasma recipients experiencing immunity illnesses, although AIDS had yet to be called by that name. In the early 80s, eminent Dutch haematologists warned the World Federation to curtail severely the use of imported factor VIII and for clotting factor to be used only for life-threatening bleeds. They asked as a temporary measure for countries to revert back to cryoprecipitate. Although inconvenient, these measures would save lives. This country did not inform patients of these concerns and give patients the option of going back to cryoprecipitate until safety of factor concentrates could be improved. This country, along with many others, did not adopt these damage limitation measures and encouraged home treatment at any cost. So is this right, Carol? Having mapped out a number of matters through the 70s, which you were saying should give rise to sufficient concern for a public inquiry, here you move to the early 80s and the continued use of factor concentrates and the failure to revert to cryoprecipitate is another area that should be explored.
Absolutely, because that was as AIDS was emerging and something needed to be done urgently. And the warning signs were flagged up and the warning signs were ignored. And I should just say, going back to the 70s, that there was never any risk assessment done prior to introducing factor concentrates.
And sorry, just pausing there, if I may, Karen, just pick up on that. Obviously, you're familiar with some of the licensing materials from the early 70s. The inquiries looked at some. I don't think a complete documentary picture still exists. But as I understand it, your point is, although licensing applications are looked at as individual licensing applications, the government didn't do, as it were, step back and undertake a risk assessment of were factor concentrates sufficiently safe to justify their use and to evaluate the benefits against the potential adverse consequences.
Absolutely, because factor concentrates were introduced into the US first in the 60s. And as soon as they were introduced, there were outbreaks of hepatitis. And even before they were introduced, you had Dr. Garrett Allen saying to the pharmaceutical companies, you cannot put this product on the shelves. You've first got to find a way to virally inactivate. And I use the analogy of early aviation. And if, for example, you said to people, I've set up this company for people to fly to another country, but what I can tell you is we haven't got the technology to necessarily get you all the way. The plane might fall out of the sky. There's a 99% risk of people being killed or being harmed. Would you like to buy a ticket? And people would say, you're absolutely mad. But in a sense, that's what happened with factor concentrates, because there was they knew from years before that, decades, that pooled plasma was dangerous with regard to hepatitis. So they put a product onto the market with a far greater risk than cryoprecipitate, which was made from single donors. And they did it, I maintain they did it the wrong way around. They should have first, even if it meant delaying, found a way to virally inactivate. Once they had discovered that, and there was, I should say, there was funding being put into that in the 60s, and the push was to get the treatment onto the shelves, onto the market, which they did, and then the funding stopped to look at ways to virally inactivate. So it was done the wrong way around, in my opinion anyway, and of course the eminent Dr. J. Garrett Allen.
And then one of the other themes that we see from so much of what you write is the corollary is if you are going to introduce them, patients have to have the full implications explained to them so that they can reach a fully informed decision about whether they, as individuals, are willing to run the risks.
Absolutely, and I mean that goes back to the Nuremberg Code. And if it's above a certain percentage risk, then you couldn't have the treatment anyway. You know, it would be too dangerous to use, but you must inform the patient of the pros and cons.
And then just returning to this letter to Mr. Milburn, you say, I asked the government to answer the following questions. And again, I'm not going to read through each of them, but you pose a number of questions relating to safety of blood products through the 70s and the 1980s. And then if we go over the page, you then pick up at point 8 the issue about the hepatitis waiver. At paragraph 9 or point 9, the issue about delays in people being tested for hepatitis C. Paragraph 10, look back. And then paragraph 12, you pose a question in relation to why were 1,200 haemophiliacs infected with HIV if everything was done. Just in relation to that question, again, was that an attempt to put it in the stark terms of look at the consequences? Surely you must want to understand how that happened.
Absolutely, because there was almost a denial by government that anything had gone wrong. You know, you had the best possible treatment at the time. Hemophiliacs knew the risks. There was a completely false narrative out there, and I wanted to make them look at the evidence to change that narrative.
And then you conclude, may I remind the government that this government's failure to address the infection of haemophiliacs through contaminated blood products, when all over Europe other countries are holding public inquiries and compensating haemophiliacs, leaves us with no option but to seek justice through the European courts. I leave you with a statement applied to Italy's health ministry after it failed to supply satisfactory answers to the questions stated above. Rome Civil Court ruled that the Health Ministry had violated duties of prudence, diligence, impartiality and legality by not controlling blood products and then not impounding them. Italy was forced to compensate. If we just look where you've put your name there, you say, on behalf of the 2-2 campaign, a second campaign for a second injustice. Can you just tell us what that was, that reference?
Yes,
there?
it was just flagging up that the first injustice that was really gained a lot of public attention was HIV infection. But in actual fact, hepatitis came before that, but it just didn't get the publicity. So second campaign for a second injustice was emphasising the hepatitis C.
And then we can see you followed up your letter to Mr Milburn by a letter to the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, WITN 1055047. You enclosed, sorry, I should say the date, it's the 12th of April 2000, you enclosed a copy of your letter to Mr Milburn. You then referred to a photograph. Is that the one you were talking about earlier?
Yes,
the
and I've
American
submitted
prisoner?
that to the inquiry.
And then, I won't read out the next few paragraphs. You essentially summarise what you'd said to Mr Milburn. And then you say, I ask for a response from yourself on the letter to Alan Milburn and reiterate our request for the following. 1, safe synthetic treatment for all haemophiliacs. So that's the recombinant bit.
Yes.
2, a full and open public inquiry. 3, recompense for infection with hepatitis C on a parity with Southern Ireland. I'll come back to that issue, Carol, the Irish comparison, because that's important. It is time that the government admitted that serious mistakes were made. Just be honest and say that you are sorry, as the Japanese and other governments have done. Do we really have to go down the line of a criminal investigation or a pre-election trial by media, or as a decent human being, do you have the courage to say that the government got it wrong? I think it's right to say your statement says you didn't get a substantive response to that letter.
No, I think I got a thank you for your letter response, and that was it.
There is a response to a letter, or a response sort of on behalf of Mr Milburn. It's a response from Lord Hunt, Philip Hunt, who was the Parliamentary Under-Secretary in the House of Lords, I think. So if we look at that, WITN 1055057. This is dated the 31st of July 2000, and it's from Lord Hunt to your MP, Jim Cousins,
yes.
who'd been raising these matters, obviously, on your behalf for quite some time by then. And we can see from the first couple of paragraphs that you'd obviously had an earlier response that you didn't think really was a proper answer to what you were asking for. And it seems as though Mr Cousins has taken that on by writing on the 19th of June to Alan Milburn, and this is the reply. If we pick it up in the 4th paragraph, the reply of 18th of May to Ms Grayson focused on hepatitis C because that had been the subject of the 30th of March debate in the House of Lords, which Ms Grayson specifically mentioned in her opening paragraph. Recent requests for a public inquiry have also focused on hepatitis C and blood products following our decision not to introduce a special payment scheme. I recognise, though, that because of her particular family circumstances, Ms Grayson is taking the wider view. Now, you obviously had mentioned hepatitis C in your letter, but were you limiting your argument that there should be a public inquiry, limiting it to the question of hepatitis C?
Not at all. I wanted it to be HIV and hepatitis viruses, and yeah, I mean, just look at the wider picture, because there was never a public inquiry for HIV.
And then we can go over the page. Just a couple of paragraphs worth, I think, drawing attention to. The first paragraph on the top of this page says, as Ms Grayson says, we were not self-sufficient in blood products in the 1970s and early 1980s. Furthermore, I understand these newly developing products were in great demand because they were seen as bringing a better quality of life for people with haemophilia, with treatment accessible in people's own homes. I hear from haemophilia doctors and others who worked with haemophiliacs that though it was known that there was an element of risk from undefined viruses, The balance assessed at that time was in favour of the blood products and their perceived benefits. Is it right to understand that, that's one of the lines that is a refrain in the communications that you got from government over the years?
It is, and that was I think the doctors have said when they've given evidence that that was their way of thinking, but haemophiliacs weren't given that choice. So I was trying to point out that, you know, how can you decide on a treatment unless you've got all the information in front of you?
And then if we go to the penultimate paragraph, so bottom half of the page, where it says, as Ms Grayson says, some countries have held inquiries and made compensation arrangements. I understand that these too have attracted criticism. That is a matter for each individual country in the light of their particular circumstances. With regard to offering hepatitis C tests to people with haemophilia from 1991 onwards, we would expect there to have been discussion between individual haemophiliacs and their haemophilia doctors, and testing carried out according to individual circumstances, according to the wishes of the patient when a test became available. Ms Grayson says that our previous replies have not covered this point because they assume that even mild haemophiliacs have regular contact with their haemophilia centres. I think we should assume that as part of their professional care for a patient, haemophilia doctors would have reached out to contact those who they may otherwise see infrequently. In some cases, their patients have moved and can no longer be contacted. In other cases, at a time when no treatment was available for hepatitis C, patients might have chosen not to be tested. Any particular observations, Carol, on that paragraph?
Yes. I mean, some haemophiliacs did not know their test results until late into the 2000s, you know, which is quite shocking. So, and also, there should have been a lot more information coming out from the Haemophilia Society, who should have been giving some, if not necessarily advice, they should have been saying, well, you know, this is the situation, you know, this is what we know with regard to testing, this is what we know with regard to hepatitis C. So there was nothing coming out there. So really, haemophiliacs were in the dark. And I think a lot of patients that didn't go in very often would have been missed.
And it might be said the assumption underpinning, or an assumption underpinning this paragraph, is that the department's expectation, the ministerial expectation, is that doctors would have done things the right way, the proper way. Is this right, Carol, that one of the points you were seeking to make and other campaigners in this and other material was that might be what doctors were expected to do, but there was evidence that they hadn't done it, and that was one of the reasons why it needed to be looked at?
Exactly, and it was on such a wide scale that was how we ended up making a complaint to the General Medical Council, because it wasn't just isolated cases. Because part of what we did with our campaign group was to get all haemophiliacs to access, if they wanted to, the medical records and look for the information of testing, when they were tested, when they were told. And haemophiliac after haemophiliac pointed out that the date they were tested and the date they were told were sometimes years apart. And so it was, you know, we thought if we went to the General Medical Council, then they would look at this on a much wider scale across the UK.
We'll come back to the General Medical Council a bit later this afternoon. And then if we just go to the next paragraph, sorry, next page.
Can I just understand this? When this paragraph was first read out to me, I thought you might be saying that the doctors were sitting on test results which they hadn't given them to the patients because they hadn't seen the patients and they hadn't bothered to go out and make contact. The other way of reading it is they hadn't tested the patient because they hadn't seen them, but they did have a duty and should have made contact rather than expect the onus to rest on the patient itself. Which way is the way you meant it?
Well, patients wouldn't have contacted because they didn't know to contact. So they didn't realise it was an issue. And one of the big things we found that was certainly for haemophiliacs that were going in regularly, they were tested and many of them had the test results withheld for years. Mild haemophiliacs were in an even worse position because, you know, they weren't written to, you know, they weren't invited to come in for a test that I'm aware of. So it could be years. I mean, some haemophiliacs that we come across, they might only have 2 bleeds, major bleeds in a lifetime. So it could be years and years before they go into the centre.
Yes, I see. Thanks. Thank you very much.
And in your statement, you described this response as largely unhelpful in moving the matters which I was discussing forward, and ends by stating, and this is the next page, so we'll just read it, that in the last paragraph, you can see Mr. Cousins has suggested a meeting, and Lord Hunt says, as you will know, the question of haemophilia and hepatitis C has received a great deal of attention since we took office, and issues relating to HIV were predominant before that time. I recognise the energy of Ms Grayson's campaigning, but I'm not sure whether any of us will gain from a meeting. Perhaps you would contact me again if you feel strongly that a meeting would be the best approach. Your response in your statement, Carol, is to say, given the points I'd raised remained largely unanswered, I felt this was dismissive and an attempt to avoid dealing with the issues I had raised.
Yes, absolutely.
A little later, we can take that document down, thanks, Lawrence. You tried to get a meeting, again with the assistance of Mr Cousins, with Alan Milburn to discuss the issues. But I don't think that got anywhere.
Didn't. That was the big thing. Every time a new health minister came in, it was a new opportunity. Maybe this one will be different.
Just for the sake of completeness, if we go to a letter a little later in 2000, so this is September 2000, WITN 1055063. This is you to Jim, so to your MP, and if we look at the paragraph beginning, I find it appalling, so just over halfway down the page. You're flagging there, as I understand it, as an additional factor pointing in favour of a public inquiry, the issue relating to BSc CJD.
Yes, because that was just starting to be an issue that haemophiliacs were concerned about.
And you point to the fact there'd been a BSc inquiry.
Yes.
With a report due out, but still nothing in relation to hepatitis C and HIV from infected blood products.
Yes, and that BSc inquiry didn't involve haemophiliacs.
And we can see the very bottom of the page is the request to Mr Cousins to try and set up a meeting with Mr Milburn to raise a number of issues. If we pick matters up then next at WITN 1055075. So you wrote again to Mr Milburn March of 2001, the following year. You haven't given up, clearly, Carol. You kept going.
I was never going to give up.
And one of the things that has, as I understand it, that led you to write this letter was the Lindsay Tribunal that was going on at this time in Ireland.
Yes, because what we found out was consultant haematologists from here were giving evidence in Ireland, but they were giving evidence on things that they hadn't discussed with the patients here. So there was this, complete contrast.
And we can see in the second paragraph, you say, I've been trying for a number of years to persuade the government to hold an open and honest public inquiry into the infection of hundreds of haemophiliacs with HIV and hepatitis viruses, and for those haemophiliacs infected and families affected to be treated with compassion and recompense for their suffering. And then we see the reference to the Lindsay Tribunal, the public inquiry in Ireland, Dr Jones there giving evidence. You then set out a number of other points, again, from really the concerns that you'd been expressing by now, as indeed, of course, at other campaigners, but been expressing over a number of years.
Absolutely, yes. Because by then we'd got hold of documents and we were becoming quite well informed. And we'd also got some of the HIV litigation documents by that point.
And if we look at the penultimate paragraph on this page, you pick up here on one of the phrases used in a lot of the government material, as I understand what you're saying here. Could the government please stop misleading the public with a factually incorrect and utterly insensitive statement used by medical professionals and politicians alike that the benefits of the treatment outweighed the risks? This might have been the case if we had used our own British products, but the facts speak for themselves.
Yes.
And if we go over the page, I'm not going to read this out, but again, you set out a number of arguments and issues. And then if we go to the third page, you say this: what haemophiliacs want is safe treatment, recombinant, to end postcode prescribing, a public inquiry and recompense. In other words, we simply want parity with AIR, who has successfully managed to provide all this to their haemophiliacs. We're near to an election date. I'm sure that the voters will be looking at how political parties deal with issues such as this when it comes to making their choice. At present, the government's attitude to the whole contaminated blood catastrophe has been to continue to withhold information and mislead the public. And then you pose the question in the last sentence of the letter: will the government now hold a public inquiry? I look forward to your reply. And we know, of course, that they did not.
Yes, no matter what evidence we presented, they just blocked us all the way.
Can we then look at WITN 1055076? So, demonstration at Whitehall, 3rd of April 2001, to campaign for a public inquiry into the provision of contaminated blood products, financial recompense, provision of recombinant factor and safer treatment. So there are the three aims at that point in time of the campaign.
Absolutely.
And we can see, I think, from the list of organisations below, the last one of which is Haemophilia Action UK.
Yes.
By now, this is something upon which a range of different groups have combined to, I don't mean combined as groups, but have joined forces, I should say, to try and press for the same aims.
Absolutely, because what we found was that government were dividing people, by virus and many other ways. And so we thought that if we could have a more combined approach, then we would be stronger. I mean, some families to this day are still divided and don't speak to each other because, one group was played off against the other, and absolutely tragic.
Now, you did then end up with a meeting at some stage with Lord Hunt. What's your recollection of that?
We got quite a reasonable time. I think it was extended to about 90 minutes. And, we managed to deliver quite a lot about the safety violations, what we thought had gone wrong, what we needed. And we came away with some optimism that things would change and that we hopefully would get out public inquiry. What did come out of it was with that and information sent from the journal, the agreement to have some kind of report, and that became the self-sufficiency report.
And you attended that meeting, just for the dates, I think it was the 9th of May 2001. It was with Colette.
It was, yes.
Colette Wintle. And you handed over a dossier of documents.
Yes, we did.
Which included some of what you regarded as some of the key documents over the years, the contemporaneous
Absolutely,
documents.
yes. And also by this time, we were getting a lot more information about the American treatment, and we were starting to trace batch numbers back.
In terms of the request for a public inquiry, we know, of course, that was declined, and we can pick that up in a letter from Lord Hunt to you, WITN 1055081. Um, 25th of April 2001, dear Ms Grayson, at the end of our meeting on 9th of May, I said that I would consider the issues that you raised and would write to you. I hope you will accept my apologies for the delay in responding to you. One of the main areas of discussion concerned the use of imported blood products from the USA in the early 70s and the impact on the transmission of bloodborne viruses, in particular hepatitis C, in people with haemophilia. And then he goes on to deal with pooling, says that the risk of hepatitis C was a universal problem. And then says this in the last sentence of that paragraph: by the time viral inactivation technology was introduced in the mid-1980s, almost all people with haemophilia receiving treatment had unwittingly been infected. We've got the word inadvertently also coming up, but what's your response to this, to the use of terminology such as unwittingly and inadvertently?
Well, I would say that government made a series of choices, and that those choices seriously impacted haemophiliacs. So it wasn't an accident. It was, people sitting together in a room and, deciding what products people should have, what should be licensed. And those decisions are not looking at donor safety. So it's not just about the haemophiliacs, it's also about donor safety. And not looking at these key issues led to people being infected. Looking at where the plasma was being sourced, what were the conditions that they were being sourced in. We found evidence of safety violation after safety violation. So it certainly wasn't unwittingly, in my view, and many others.
Just on that phrase, did anyone ever give you any explanation as to how that phrase, unwittingly been infected, sat with the risks of treatment were outweighed by the benefits, which might suggest that the risks were known, and this suggests they weren't?
Yes, I mean, the risks weren't conveyed to haemophiliacs before they started taking the treatment, as obviously that letter sent to my husband's parents showed. It was, will you go on to this treatment, and nothing but good can come of it. And the government would use lines like haemophiliacs asked for this treatment, but haemophiliacs, were being told that there's wonderful miracle treatment onto the market, and you should all be on it. But they weren't being told the risks. They weren't being given a choice. So naturally, if somebody only gives you the positive side, you're going to say, well, this looks fantastic, we'll go for this treatment. And the Haemophilia Society at the time was pushing for the treatment and wanting the US treatment. So, haemophiliacs believed that was the best choice because that was what they were told.
Thank you.
And then the next paragraph refers to the licensing process. After that, we get to the public inquiry. We discuss the government's position concerning a public inquiry. I do understand that people with haemophilia who were infected with hepatitis C want to know how it happened. However, the facts have been set out clearly on numerous occasions through debates in both houses, meetings with Department of Health ministers and in correspondence. Whilst the government has great sympathy for those infected with hepatitis C and has considered the call for a public inquiry very carefully, they do not think it is the way to go forward. That
last sentence was cut and pasted in so many letters. It was just standard.
And no doubt we can ask Mr Milburn, who was still the Secretary of State, I think at the time Lord Hunt sent this letter, about the government's position more generally. But in any event, it was a no. Did you regard this, or indeed any of the other communications you received from the department, as ever actually grappling with the substance of the points that you were raising?
No, I felt all the time that government were probably concerned about litigation and that everything was geared towards damage limitation and towards giving over a picture that everything the government did was for the benefit of haemophiliacs. Nothing could have been done differently. So I felt we were fobbed off time and time again.
If we go over the page, the first paragraph refers to the public inquiry in the Irish Republic and the compensation scheme there. Again, we'll come back to that, Carol, if that's all right with you. But the next paragraph then deals with the second of these three campaign aims. So they've dismissed the request for a public inquiry. This now turns to the request for financial recompense. The government has met many representatives of the haemophilia community since 1997 and listened to their arguments for a special payment scheme for people with haemophilia and hepatitis C, similar to that in place for HIV. After long and careful consideration at the time, we came to the same conclusion reached by the previous government, that a special payment scheme should not be established.
There's just something I'd like to point
Yes,
out
absolutely.
there. Government were generally meeting with representatives of the Haemophilia Society, which weren't necessarily representing all at all. And we had the evidence that the society didn't, at that time, didn't want our evidence and got very angry with us when we discussed this evidence. And they wanted to go for a completely different approach. We wanted compensation. I wrote to them in '96 about compensation on a parity with ERA. They looked at it and then decided to go for a hardship fund. So we were completely at odds with the society. So the government were, in a sense, going to people that didn't have the evidence. And we kept saying, you're never going to get anywhere unless you allow campaigners to be with you. What should have happened was campaigners should have gone with the society to government, and if the society didn't have the evidence, they should have given us a route in so we could present that evidence. But they, again, blocked all the way.
And so where it says the government has met many representatives of the haemophilia community since 1997, your point is what they've met was representatives of the Haemophilia Society.
Yes, yes.
And then the next paragraph, succeeding ministers have reviewed this decision and reached the same conclusion. It has also been debated on numerous occasions in both houses. It's not a view we've come to lightly. The government position has long since been that, as a general rule, compensation should not be paid where there has not been negligence. We will continue to review the position. Now, obviously, that's an issue that's been explored with recent witnesses and will continue to be explored with witnesses over the next 3 weeks. But that's the no. Again, so you've had no to a public inquiry and no to any form of financial recompense for hepatitis C.
Yes, and we were saying, well, how do you know there's been no negligence if you won't actually, look at the evidence, if you won't look at the research? We're just going round in circles here.
And then the next paragraph deals with the waiver, and then the paragraph beyond that deals with the position in relation to recombinant, which was the third main element of the strategy. So that's the rejection in Philip Hunt's letter. You didn't give up, Carol.
I didn't.
So we can see, for example, a letter that you wrote in 2002, WITN 10555088, to Yvette Cooper. It's a long letter, and I'm not going to read through the detail of it. But here, you were in particular concerned about issues relating to documentation. What was in a nutshell, the point you were trying to pick up with Ms. Cooper?
That a lot more evidence had come to light, that we'd got hold of more documents on the HIV litigation, that we were learning more about Lord Owen's concerns over missing documents, and that we wanted all these issues to be examined.
And then if we go, and again, I should stress, these are examples of correspondence. This is not an exhaustive description of all the letters that you sent.
It cost us a fortune in ink, I do recall.
And then if we go to WITN 10555092, we see you writing in January 2003 to Hazel Blears and Lord Hunt.
Yeah.
So Ms Blears now the relevant junior minister, and Lord Hunt still, I think, the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State in the Lords. I think need to read out the detail of it, but you pick up on the first page about the issue of testing for hepatitis C without consent.
Yes.
And then there is a further discussion in relation to that. If we go on to page 5, I think we can just pick it up at the last paragraph. We demand that government holds a full and open public inquiry into the contamination of haemophiliacs with HIV and hepatitis C. And just pausing there, The letter from Lord Hunt had, I think, looked at it on the basis of hepatitis C alone, but as you've already observed,
Yes, I think so.
you were not simply raising hepatitis C, you were also saying the HIV infection, the circumstances in which haemophiliacs were infected with HIV also required a public inquiry.
Absolutely, because in the 1991 litigation, the documents were never seen in court. And so, I got the shock of my life when I started to access these documents and look at the evidence. And I could see why the government wouldn't want them in court, because, it was looking increasingly as if they were allegedly liable.
And then if we go skip over the next few paragraphs just to the last sentence of that paragraph, only a full and open public inquiry where mistakes are admitted and addressed will serve to give patients the confidence to return to their haemophilia centres to be treated. I think that should be treated.
Yeah.
But the point you were making there, as I understand it, Carol, was this was something that it wasn't just historic. It was still impacting on the people who'd been infected. And it was impacting in terms of a lack of confidence in the National Health Service and in doctors.
Absolutely, because as more evidence came to light and haemophiliacs were learning what had gone on, they began to be quite afraid to go to the centres. And the relationships with the consultants were starting to break down. So it was really important, we thought, to address it quickly, so that patients felt they could go to the hospital and, and that they wouldn't be exposed to another virus or things would be covered up. So we which is why we went to the GMC. We thought this was really important.
If we then move to 2004, because we know, of course, the government did not respond in 2003 with a public inquiry, the position, obviously, in relation to financial assistance for hepatitis C did change in 2003 with the decision to set up what became Skipton.
Yes.
And we'll be looking at that, obviously, with witnesses over the coming weeks. But if we just pick matters up in 2004 now, WITN 1055114. This is a letter from Melanie Johnson, Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Public Health. It's 1st of June 2004, and it's addressed to Lord Morris, Alf Morris. And he has obviously received correspondence from you, and he is passing those on and asking Ms Johnson as the relevant junior minister to deal with these issues.
Yes.
Again, I don't think I need to read through most of the letter, but if we go to the second page, just want to pick matters up. It's the fourth paragraph, just over halfway down the page. Ms Grayson also asks for a public inquiry, particularly into the sourcing of plasma. I believe it is important to stress that the government does not accept that any wrongful practices were employed and does not consider a public inquiry as justified, as we do not believe that any new light would be shed on this issue as a result. Now, Carol, as you've already pointed out, one of the lines that had been taken by the government was a belief that there was no negligence.
Yes.
Here we've got a not accepting that there's any wrongful practices, which might be said to go wider than negligence. And then does not consider a public inquiry as justified, as we do not believe that any new light would be shed on this issue as a result. What was your thinking on receiving this letter?
Well, it was just impossible to understand because we were presenting so much evidence, so much written information. Letter after letter. We were doing media articles, presenting evidence through the media. We were making complaints. I mean, at this point, we'd already gone to the police, we'd gone to the GMC, we'd gone to Europe. We'd gone, in several different directions with our evidence. So that it wasn't a lack of evidence. There was, there was a massive amount of evidence, but the government just didn't want to address it at all.
And then we can see the next two paragraphs refer to the review of internal papers commissioned by Yvette Cooper. And that's what resulted in the self-sufficiency report that you then analysed in your dissertation.
And the point obviously mentioned before my dissertation was it wasn't so much important what was in it as what was left out. The most key documents that were crucial to establishing what had happened to haemophiliacs were not in that report.
Now, that was 2004. I'm going to come all the way forward now to 2017. But that's not because you weren't yourself continuing to press in those intervening years, and we'll look at Archer and Penrose in a moment. But you carried on,
yes,
trying to get a public inquiry, and then in 2017, you and Colette wrote to the then Prime Minister, Mrs May. Sometimes difficult to keep track in modern times of who is Prime Minister at any one time. WITN 1055180. And I think it... I'm not going to read the whole letter, it's a long one, but I think it may be worth reading some parts of this first page. Our names are Colette Wintle and Carol Grayson. We are members of the haemophilia community, and we are writing to you in our capacity as long-term campaigners and victims of the contaminated blood disaster. You are now fighting for your political life, but we have been forced to fight for 30 long years for truth and justice. In that time, we have endured the horror of knowing that 2,500 haemophiliacs' lives have been lost due to governmental negligence on a scale that scandalises the behaviour of every government since the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS began. We in the haemophilia community have suffered unimaginable pain and loss on an incomparable scale not experienced by any other patient group within the United Kingdom. We've been ignored, refused justice, and further punished by the DWP with draconian measures designed by yours and previous governments to make our lives unbearably difficult financially, just because successive governments have refused to admit liability and an admission of negligence on an industrial scale. It's only after months of challenges with claimants left on nil income, their trauma increased, that wrongful decisions by unqualified assessors have finally been reversed. What a waste of taxpayers' money. This is why it is essential haemophiliacs and their bereaved partners are passported out of the benefit system. That's another issue I'm going to come back to, Carol.
yes.
Not only are haemophiliacs sick and dying, but spouses/partners are now suffering serious health problems as a result of this avoidable tragedy. You have been asked to consider a public inquiry and have refused us several times with the excuse that an independent, the Archer inquiry, and Scottish-led inquiry, Penrose, have shown that no fault was found. But with due respect, neither of these had it in their remit to find anybody liable or demonstrate negligence. However, that does not mean that negligence by public bodies did not occur, and there is substantial evidence in the possession of campaigners who can show that gross safety violations did occur with the full knowledge of government. In fact, Lord Archer had to inform witnesses that any evidence submitted showing alleged negligence/liability had to be excluded. This was the same for Penrose. You also said all the evidence is in the public domain. It is certainly not in the 2006 DOH self-sufficiency report, far from it. We believe you have been wrongly advised by your ministers and civil servants at the Department of Health on the real facts and truth, which has destroyed the lives of innocent victims and their families. You have it within your power to do what your predecessor David Cameron said he could do when questioned by Rory Stewart MP during his last PMQs, and that is to ensure certain measures are carried out. And then you set out the extract from Rory Stewart's contribution as follows. One of the most disturbing scandals has been the infection of thousands of people across the nation with HIV and hepatitis C through contaminated blood. Today, Lord Penrose publishes a report that follows nearly 25 years of campaigning by members on both sides of this House to address the scandal. Will the Prime Minister, as the last act of his government, ensure that there is a full apology, transparent publication, and above all, proper compensation for the families terribly affected by this scandal? You then set out, you and Colette set out David Cameron's reply as the then Prime Minister. And then underneath that you say this, so it's beneath the bold print. Prime Minister, since this declaration, not only has nothing been done to improve the lives of victims and their families, but an undemocratic and we believe unethical and allegedly illegal consultation was forced on our community without the full and proper consultation with all campaign groups and in particular with us. You refer then to meetings with Anne Milton. Again, I want to come back to those. And to inadequacies in the consultation process. And
I think what I was referring to with the meetings was that I think that was at the time at which government was wanting to get rid of the McFarlane Trust.
Yes. Yeah, that's absolutely right. So that I think you're just talking about the consultation processes or the decision-making processes which ultimately led to the establishment of the 4 devolved schemes.
Yes, an important thing to mention there, as we found out after the event, that there was a deliberate effort not to include long-term campaigners. So to this day, Colette and I, 2 of the longest-standing campaigners, have never been consulted on whether McFarlane Trust should continue or not. And that decision should have gone to all haemophiliacs and their families.
And then I think need to read the rest out, but you say the actions of your government demonstrate a hard-hearted attitude that shows lessons will never be learned and shames the UK political system. And you draw attention to the Grenfell Tower tragedy, not as I read this, because you're in a sense seeking to say that what happened there was anything other than utterly horrific.
Absolutely.
But you're making the point that has rightly led to a public inquiry,
Exactly.
investigation, concerns. Why hasn't what happened through infected blood products received similar attention?
Yes, because, to us, the Grenfell Tower was absolutely horrendous. What did happen was quite a quick decision towards a public inquiry, and we couldn't understand how we were 25 years or so down the line and we couldn't get one. And our numbers of the dead, just say about 2,500, were way higher as well.
So we can take that down, thank you. So that I hope, Carol, gives a flavour of the work you've undertaken over the years to press for a public inquiry. I want to turn to some other issues, but just before I do so, just whilst we're still on the theme of inquiries, we saw in those communications the references to the Archer inquiry and to the Penrose inquiry. If we take the Archer inquiry first, you gave evidence to the Archer inquiry.
I gave evidence twice as a widow and also as a researcher, and I worked really, really closely with the inquiry, sending information to VJ. It was a privately funded inquiry, very, very limited resources, and there was, as mentioned, no remit to find liability.
And you had also been, we've seen it reflected in some of the correspondence that we've looked at, but involved in the campaigning that led to the Archer inquiry being set up. Yes,
and it was Lord Morris who, he knew Lord Archer and managed to get that going.
Now you tell us in your statement of your disappointment with the government response. I'm not going to go through the government response again because that's an issue we're going to be looking at in future inquiry hearings. But what was it in particular that concerned you as someone who'd invested so many decades of your life by this point in time about the government response?
To Lord Archer?
To Lord Archer's inquiry.
Because the government responded by blocking us on lies, because Lord Archer had given very good recommendations, and one of the main one was compensation on a parity with ERA. The government then rejected it by saying that ERA was different because ERA paid out on legal liability. And we knew that that was a lie. So Colette and I went to Ireland and we contacted the Irish government, Irish Haemophilia Society and the Irish lawyers that had represented haemophiliacs. And we had letters back saying that in Ireland they'd paid out on loss and need, that there was no legal liability, and they'd done so because they were recognising the distress caused to haemophiliacs. The term is extraordinary suffering. They paid out on the grounds of extraordinary suffering.
So the recommendation that emerged out of the Archer inquiry on that particular issue was not accepted by the government here. And that was one of the things that particularly troubled you about the government's response to the Archer report.
Yes, because that was the only objection that they put forward, which led us to challenge by judicial review.
And that's the judicial review that resulted in the judgment from, I've temporarily forgotten which judge it is. Mr. Justice Holman, thank you, Ms. Scott. Yes.
And Hemophiliac took that.
Yes, and indeed you assisted with the provision of information in relation to
We
it.
did. We gave that person who'd requested help from us, or from myself, and then including Colette, we gave information that we collected from Ireland in 2004, because we actually, when we had discussions, we thought it was better if that JR went in the name of an infected haemophiliac. I had been going to take one as a partner, and I thought, well, I've got the evidence, so I can assist, with that. So that's what we did, and it was a positive result.
In fact, the issue relating to the scheme in Ireland was a theme you'd been addressing earlier in correspondence with, was it Lord Warner?
I first asked for compensation on a parity with ERA in 1996, which was when we learnt of what Ireland had granted their haemophiliacs. And that was when I first wrote to the Haemophilia Society. They looked at it and then they said, no, we'll go for a hardship fund.
And one of the concerns that you voiced, and we can see it at WITN 1055105.
Sorry, just to say, yes, we had challenged Lord Warner in a series of letters, and anybody else that came out with the line that Ireland paid out on liability.
Yeah, and that was the point you were making again. I don't think I need to read out the letter, but this is an example of a letter you wrote to Lord Warner on this very topic, February 2004, suggesting that the government line about why there was no need to follow the Irish course was inaccurate.
Yes.
And we can see if we look at WITN 1055106. Again, I'm not going to go through the detail of it, but this is a letter that you received following inquiries in Ireland, setting out the basis or more information about the way in which the Irish scheme operated.
Yes, absolutely.
Because you wanted to essentially demonstrate that what was being said to you by the Department of Health was not correct.
Exactly.
Now, in terms of other inquiries, the Penrose inquiry, you tried to engage with the Penrose inquiry, but to little avail, as I understand it.
Yes, I wanted to give evidence, and I said I had evidence that was cross-border and some evidence that was very specific to Scotland. And I was basically told that I couldn't give evidence. They weren't interested in hearing from me, and I was utterly frustrated. Going back to the Archer inquiry,
yes,
I would say that was an important inquiry. I mean, it wasn't on this scale, but I keep seeing in the media that Archer was a whitewash. It wasn't a whitewash. Lord Archer did the best that he could with very limited finances in, very different circumstances. Penrose, I do believe, was a whitewash. He just didn't want to engage at all, wasn't interested in the evidence that I had. But then I later found out that Penrose had accessed a lot of evidence that I'd given to Archer. I found that from Haemophilia Scotland.
I don't think we need to go to the detail of it, but we can put the article up on screen. WITN 1055178. Is an article by you posted on the 25th of March 2015, which I think was the date upon which the final report was published.
Yes.
I think we get the flavour of it, Carol, if I may say so, from the title. Penrose
Yes.
Inquiry, Contaminated Blood, Biological Terrorism and Cover-Up Under a Failed Western Democracy. And you you refer there to a number of concerns about both the history and about the Penrose inquiry.
Yes, I do.
Can I then ask you on an entirely separate topic from the issues that we've been talking about, Carol, about some involvement you had with a family from New Zealand? I'm not going to mention names, and I'm going to ask you to do likewise, if that's okay, whose son had been treated whilst on holiday in Scotland.
Yes, yes.
So this was a boy with haemophilia who'd not received factor concentrates in his home country.
That's correct.
On holiday in Scotland, given commercial factor concentrates at York Hill Hospital.
Yes, and that was 1980.
You were provided some assistance, I think, to that family in terms of providing information and helping them ask questions. Again, without giving any details of the family name, what can you tell us about that?
Well, Babs Evans at the Haemophilia Society contacted me and asked me to help this family. And the gentleman came over and we met up. And obviously he didn't know the system in this country, so I was able to advise him how to apply for medical records for his son. And he did that, and accordingly we were able to establish what treatment, at a particular time. And then after that, he got a solicitor involved, and he decided to sort of deal with it very directly. And he flew to America and had a meeting directly with the plasma company representatives. I think it was Chicago. And there were no other risk factors for that little boy. So it was, in a way, I thought it was a very, quite an easy, in a sense, a case to argue because there was no other risk factors. And I was able to provide additional information on that particular plasma company and some of their alleged safety violations. So he literally went there and confronted them head on, and a payment was made.
Do you know from your discussions with that family whether any effort had been made by York Hill Hospital to trace them and inform them of the possibility of infection, or was this something they'd found out for themselves years later?
It had taken years of searching on the family's part to get to the point where they reached that, concluded that it must be York Hill. And that was when they were prepared to fly here and dig around and get as much evidence as they could. And then, of course, there was a cluster of infections at that same hospital of children. And I mean, I felt it was really important that other families knew that, because obviously there was a payment made to the New Zealand family, and there should have been payments made to other families as well. But what happened was the gentleman basically said, wait a while, and then, once we've got the payment and it's secure, you can discuss this, and we'll give you the documents and you can use them at the appropriate time.
So this is really for your benefit rather than a question for Carol, but it's a point that's been raised with me by legal representatives for call participants. This may be a case additional to the cases at York Hill listed in the Penrose report. And that's a point which I'm merely repeating as a possibility and a possible area for further investigation.
Well, thank you. I'll bear that in mind.
Carol, we've talked about, you've referred to a meeting that you had with Anne Milton.
Yes.
And I wanted to go back to that. So if we could please have WITN 1055149. So we can see it's headed Haemophilia/contaminated blood, the case for partners, carers, widows and proposals for resolution. submission to Anne Milton, Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Health, by Carol Grayson. And then if we go to the heading Introduction and a little background, on the 22nd of July 2010, Hemophiliac Colette Wintle and I were grateful to meet with Anne Milton, Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Health, to discuss the issues for females with bleeding disorders infected by bloodborne viruses and affected partners of haemophiliacs, the carers and the bereaved. We particularly wanted to highlight the need for gender justice, as over the years females within the haemophilia community have not been given the same consideration as males in financial terms with regard to their multiple losses. Now, I'm not going to read through the detail of the submission. You provided quite a lot of documentation to her. And there's also a note of the meeting that you and Colette had with Anne Milton. We can look at it in a moment if we need to. But how did that meeting come about, and what was its significance from your perspective?
I'm trying to think how we actually got that meeting. I think it might have been through Colette. And what we wanted to do, we wanted to put across the female perspective, because it had been greatly ignored. We felt the meeting had actually gone quite well, and Anne Milton, herself being, I think, a former health professional, understood a lot of the issues we were talking about, and she was actually willing to take some measures. But unfortunately, we later heard that she herself had been blocked on the things that she'd committed that she would do. One of those was to passport those that had been infected and affected, so that we didn't have to go through the dreadful DWP system. Also, we had asked her to please look at the evidence and remove the word inadvertent infection, which she agreed to do, and that stood. I mean, that went ahead, and we were since able to get apologies from other politicians when they used that word, and we reminded them and showed them the minutes, and they then removed the word inadvertent. So from 2010 onwards, we can't refer to the accidental infection of haemophiliacs and some of their partners.
And we can just see that set out in the note of the meeting at WITN 1055150. And we can see the point you've just made picked up in the last 5 lines or so. Sorry, let me pick it up earlier than that. CW, so that's Colette, passed a vital document kindly provided by CG, that's you and her late husband, which highlighted the misunderstanding within DOH on state of knowledge of non-A, non-B hepatitis during the 1970s and 80s, and when it was known to be deadly. The Minister was visibly shocked when she read the statement by Dr. Ritzer, quoted from HIV, The Myth. Is that the Ritzer quote that's set out in your dissertation?
Yes, yes.
And the document that you refer to, or that this note refers to Colette passing, what document's that? Do you know?
Gosh, I can't remember which one it was.
Don't worry. I think you provided quite a lot of material, not least some extracts from your dissertation. So I'm sure I can find the answer to my own question. Right. In any event, you say at the bottom in this note, the Minister accepts that a change of language and understanding that non-A, non-B was not an inadvertent infection must now be acknowledged, which CG, that's you, and CW Colette have been challenging the DOH on for many years. So that's that point about that use of language.
Exactly.
And the issue about the use of language to present a narrative is one of the very points you've been making in your dissertation, wasn't it? Absolutely,
because in order to come up with a word like that, you've actually got to have investigated, to see whether that's an adequate description.
If we go on in this to page 3, there's a number of issues that are raised by you and by Colette. And then here we can see in the 3rd paragraph the issue of widows and partners' losses, loss of loved ones, not being able to have children, loss of career. She, that's you, highlighted that in a number of cases the women carers were also often the main wage earners due to husbands being unable to work. This loss of employment resulted in loss of wages and pension rights, Partners were unable to get life insurance, therefore there was no financial security. In some cases, women were forced to sell their home. The financial losses have been significant, and CG was keen to explain to the Minister that widows need to be assessed in their own right and not as an appendage to their husband. Now, I flagged that up, Carol, because it's obviously very timely in relation to the evidence the inquiry's hearing on Monday and Tuesday. But this has been another feature of yours and Colette's campaigning over the years, the position in particular of widows, partners and other family members.
Absolutely. And I would say when I read Robert Francis' report, it's still an issue which I'm concerned about and flagging up, because when it came to partners, with men, it was mentioned that they would be looking at loss of earnings. When it came to their partners, there was a mention of looking at carer costs. But we were professionals too. We had jobs, we had careers, we had loss of earnings. So there could be quite a significant difference between, applying to get basic carer costs, and if you had quite a significant career and the potential to earn quite a lot. So I am concerned about that, and I have flagged it up with my lawyers. So I do think I would ask Sir Robert Francis to consider that this could be seen as misogynist, because especially as some of us were the main wage earners.
Well, very happy to pick that up in his evidence next week.
Thank you.
We can take that down. One of the seminal documents from the inquiry's perspective, and a document that has, I think, undoubtedly been one of your old friends for many years, is the letter from Dr. Spence Galbraith.
Absolutely.
May 1983.
Yes.
To the Department of Health. We don't need to put it on screen. You could probably recite it, I suspect.
Probably could.
You had some interactions with Dr. Spence Galbraith. How did that come about?
I managed to find out where he was and made contact. I think I probably did it through the Public Health Laboratory Service, or whatever it was called, because it changed names. And did manage to get some contact details, contacted, and he was delighted to be contacted, because all these years he'd sort of held on to this fact that he had tried to do the right thing, get the US treatment off the shelves, May 1983, and in his eyes had been blocked. So he saw me as an ally, and I got in touch with him because at the time, it was 2007, and we were making a news night which went out in April 2007. And they wanted to speak to Dr. Galbraith. And he wasn't in particularly good health. He'd had some health issues for years, but he was totally on the ball mentally, bright as a button. And we ended up having quite long conversations and becoming almost like friends, and to the point where he invited me to stay with him. And I would have gone, but unfortunately he died before I could make that trip. But he wanted me to help him litigate against a certain individual who he believed was responsible for blocking him. And in a short note, which you have a copy of, he refers to giving that person a little shock.
We'll put it on screen. I don't think that there's any need to hide the name of the person we're talking about.
Right.
Because I don't think we can understand what you're saying otherwise.
Okay.
And we do have a statement from the person you're talking about setting out his recollection. So
yes.
He was talking about Joseph Smith, Dr. Smith, now Sir Joseph Smith.
He was talking about Joseph Smith.
This is Joseph Smith, not Jim Smith.
Joseph Smith, Committee on the Safety of Medicines, Biological Subcommittee, yes. And we've got a statement, I should say, a written statement from Joseph Smith, which was disclosed, I think, to all participants some time ago. And I know Carol's seen it.
And I've responded again to that, yes. I believe. Yes.
It's really the interaction with Dr. Spence Galbraith that's of particular interest. And the note he wrote to you, WITN 1055133. This is dated 14th of April 2008. I think you said 2007 earlier. I don't know whether you had interactions with him in both years, whether he's got the date wrong or whether you have.
I had at the time of Newsnight, because at the time of Newsnight he sent me some documents at that point. But I actually had copies of Spence Galbraith's letter in the early 2000s, but then when I contacted him in 2007, he wouldn't work directly with Newsnight, but he would work through me. He said he would help, but he trusted me, so he decided he'd work through me.
And then this is Dr. Spence Galbraith's note to you, and I can confirm we've obviously, because we redact signatures, but underneath that box GROC is the signature of Spence Galbraith. It says, "Dear Mrs. Grayson, or Ms. Grayson, I found my original letter to the Department of Health concerning the withdrawal of American imported Factor VIII. Enclosed is a copy for your records." And then before we read on, if we can just go over the page.
So I have two versions of that. I had one which I got from the from the HIV litigation, which has got a sort of flower mark on it. And this is his original that he. So I was using the one with the flower mark for Newsnight, which I already had. But then I got in touch, and he wanted to give me a copy of the original as it was.
And here's his letter, familiar to us, but without that marking that we've got so used to seeing. And then the next page is the first of his 3-page note. If we go back to the handwritten note then on page 1 of this document, he says this: "I would like to give Joe Smith another little shock by sending it to him. Can you please," and I think that might say remind me, but I'm not entirely sure, "can you please something me of the committee he chaired which turned down or ignored my warning? Also, can you give me his address, which I think you must have in your files. Very best wishes, Spence Galbraith."
Yes. I didn't have his address. I didn't have Joe Smith's address.
But in any event, that's the letter that you got from Dr. Spence Galbraith. And he's such an important figure in these events that
absolutely. And we had a number of long telephone calls with his wife present on the call.
We can take that down. Can I then ask you just a little more now about your experience of trying to go through other avenues, not getting a public inquiry, so you try to raise concerns through other avenues, and you've mentioned the two main avenues already, the police and the General Medical Council.
Yes, yes.
You've given us a number of the documents relating to that, or we've got them from other sources, but and I don't at the moment propose to look at the documents themselves. It would be useful, Carol, to hear your experience of, first of all, going to the police.
Yes, I mean, initially I went to the police with Pete in Newcastle, didn't get anywhere there. I think they just didn't understand the issue. And then we were down, Colette and several other people, and I think it was Mossy, were down for a demonstration in London, and we decided to go to the Met. So we went there and said we wanted to make a complaint and explained. And they said, well, you'll all have to go back to your police in your area. So we decided on one particular week or 2 weeks, we'd all coordinate our complaints at the same time, so they might take us more seriously. And the Newcastle police said it would need to be referred to, excuse my pronunciation, but Dyfed Powys Police in Wales, and that they were the police force that dealt with corporate manslaughter, which was an issue that we were looking at the time. So we filed as many documents in there as possible, but it was only meant to be the start. You know, we wanted the police to investigate further. We were saying, this is what we've got, this is what we believe, and we would like you to investigate. We've since heard that basically the material was sat on. And in fact, there was, just recently, there was a conference at Cumberland Lodge, and that was the police looking back at historic cases where they hadn't acted. One of them, or they'd not acted appropriately, one being Hillsborough, one being contaminated blood, and several other historic investigations. And it didn't start well because they contacted somebody who had not been involved in the police complaint and invited him. Those of us that had been actively involved were not invited. And I said, well, how did you go to this person and invite them when they weren't involved in the original complaint? And they said, well, we just Googled a name for somebody campaigning. So that person got an invitation, but then after conversations, they apologised to us and realised that we were the initial complainants. Colette did attend. I was very suspicious, and I just had a gut feeling that this was going to go wrong. And yes, I mean, basically, they weren't, even though they were admitting things hadn't been properly investigated, they weren't prepared to reopen things. So it was basically a one-day event with a half-hearted apology, but no structure to go forward.
And just to go back to the original investigation or non-investigation, so you went to Northumbria Police.
Yes.
So you went to the Met. They said go to your local police. You went to Northumbria Police, and then they essentially passed it to Difford Powys.
Yes, we went to Northumbria Police first, the main headquarters. They didn't really do anything. I think they thought it wasn't their area. It was a sort of medical issue, and I don't think they understand that there could be a criminal element. So then, when we were campaigning in London, a group of us went to the Met, which included Colette, Steve, and our friend Mossy, and we had mentioned it to other campaigners across the country. So then, through discussions on a particular time scale, within about a week or 2 weeks, we all launched our complaints. We went to Newcastle Police, and they referred us to Difford Powys, and everybody in England and Wales was referred to Difford Powys. It's a different law in Scotland, so I think they went to a different, is it the convener or something? It's a different anyway in Scotland, but they also launched complaints. But we since spoke to a person who was high up in the police who had done a little bit of investigating himself, and he said, well, it was on a desk, and it just work wasn't done on it to really sort of take it to the Crown Prosecution Service in a way that it would be investigated. So what we had given initially as a starting point, and we said, could you look here and here? This is what we think has happened. Can you investigate? None of that happened.
So I note the time. I'd lost track of the time in questioning.
Sorry.
I can pick up the GMC after the break.
Yes, well, let's do that. Then we'll have a break for half an hour and come back at 10 to 4.
Okay.
10 to 4.